my opinion, outlaw motorcycle gangs are sophisticated criminal networks. They are not mistaken fundraisers or bike enthusiasts who get together for weekend rides. They are organised criminals.
Around Australia, bikie gangs have powerful and deadly relationships. Their criminal activities ongoing and widespread. Organised gangs that regularly intimidate, take revenge and have no regard or fear of the law. While the police watch the bikies with regular surveillance, the bikies watch the police.
There was an example where the Nomads have tried to intimidate a very senior officer at the time who was driving on the F3 back into Newcastle, where obviously members of the Nomads were out doing something on their bikes. They came up and basically circled the car, rode very closely alongside of this senior officer who was travelling with his wife. They were not in colours, but it was obviously clear who they were and what type of a message that they were trying to put forward. In my view, it was just quite clear that we're here. You may be a very senior police officer, but we don't care, and we're here and we're doing business.
Bikie business is Australia-wide. At any time, indiscriminately exploding onto our streets. Adelaide, 1999. A gun battle in the centre of town put everyday citizens in danger. 3 rebels dead.
We see drug manufacture, drug trafficking, overt violence, firearms acquisition and use, witness intimidation, extortions.
In 2007, at the Adelaide Dance Music Awards, the Hells Angels and the Rebels turned up.
The wild brawl that threw 600 people into chaos at Amy Stadium was sparked by a turf war between the Rebels and the Hells Angels.
A fight broke out. It was only luck that innocent bystanders weren't killed.
Fortunately, no one was seriously injured, or no one was injured as a result of the shooting, but the potential was for multiple casualties.
The following year, a wave of bikie violence swept the city. It led to tough new laws. It is now an offence to be a member of an outlaw motorcycle gang in South Australia. Over in Western Australia, there's predominantly 5 outlaw motorcycle gangs spreading violence and doing business in crime.
Well, we've seized millions of dollars off these groups over the last 10 to 15 years, and the vast majority of that is proceeds of crime, proceeds of organised crime and violent crime across the states.
The most infamous of these crimes involved ex-Western Australian policeman Don Hancock and the Gypsy Jokers. In 2000, Don Hancock and his family had retired to the small goldfields town of Orabanda. The former head of the Perth CIB, he was back where he grew up. Hancock owned the pub and he had restored a gold battery. He and his wife Elizabeth lived nearby.
I was very proud of him because I knew how hard he'd worked all his life, for it, and he was a very decent man,
He retired, and in many ways he had the dream retirement of a police officer.
On Sunday, October 1st, 2000, a half a dozen Gypsy Jokers turned up at the pub. Things got out of hand and Don Hancock closed the bar.
So he stood up and said, righto, last drinks everyone, I'm going to close the hotel. And the bikies left.
The bikies cut down a tree. It was about 7 or 8 metres tall with a chainsaw, and they set fire to it, and that became their campfire. Without warning, after the hours of darkness, a couple of shots rang out in the night, and the bikies went straight to ground, hid behind trees, trying to establish what was happening and who was firing at them. So they eventually moved back to the seat. 3 of them were sitting on the seat, and William Billy Grierson was one of those. And he was sitting next to other bikies. The shot rang out in the night, struck him in the back and pierced his body. He died almost immediately at that scene.
One of the guys that lived there stopped me and said, Elizabeth, what's going on? I said, what do you mean? And he said, there's a bikie been shot. And that was the first I knew of it. And with that I went home and told Don. And he laughed. He said, "Don't be ridiculous." And I said, "Somebody shot him. Apparently he's been shot." And next thing we know, police were there and they all reckon Don must have done it because he closed the pub on them.
We don't step aside from the fact that Don Hancock, from a police perspective, in that homicide investigation, was the principal person of interest. He was there, things had happened in the evening, and the investigation team had a clear focus on trying to work out whether he was responsible for that death or not.
Over the next year, the Hancocks lived through a reign of terror. The hotel was bombed.
Owner Don Hancock had left just minutes earlier. 3 weeks later, another 2 explosions, this time targeting the town's old general store and gold crusher. That same night, a vacant house torched. The link, Don Hancock. He owned all 3 properties. At that stage, police wanted him under protection.
The next 12 months, we had threats, and it was terrifying, really, because every time you walked out your front door, you didn't know whether Don was going to be shot or whatever.
Don Hancock wanted to live his life to the full. He knew that he was under threat by the Bikies thereafter. But he put to us that he didn't want to go into witness protection.
He said, "I'm not going to stop living just because they're going to threaten me, so he just went on living as much as his life as best he could, and me as also. But, it was horrible. Man, he was very brave. He never complained about it. He just said to me once, "Well, if they do kill me and something's done about the Bikies, it'll be worth it. And that's anything that I can do. I reckon it's worth it then," because he was like that.
Hancock moved back to Perth. There was not a lot left in Ora Banda. Police continued to warn Don Hancock of the dangers he faced. He continued to ignore them. A year after the shooting, Don Hancock organised a day at the races with his mate Lou Lewis. A few beers and a bet.
On that day, at the Belmont Racecourse, there were other members of the Gypsy Jokers conducting surveillance on Don Hancock and Lou Lewis. They were watching to see their movements. Sid Reed and another senior member of the Gypsy Jokers, who had placed the bomb under the passenger seat, had returned to their observation point in a nearby car park. At about 5:30, after the last race, Don Hancock and Lou Lewis drove away, back home, back to Lathlane. By that time, Lou Lewis had driven the mere 2 to 3 kilometres back to Don Hancock's home, and they were in the process of just pulling onto the front verge when the power gel detonated, causing both of them to lose their life.
Elizabeth and her son Paul had popped up the street to the video store.
We were actually there when it happened. On the way home, I didn't hear anything, but apparently it was heard for miles. But I came up down the railway parade and went to turn into our street, and there were police cars and everything. It was chaotic, people all out in the street, and I pulled around the corner and I just knew something had happened. And I got out of the car and Paul got out and started to run up the street, and they stopped him. Yeah. Well, I started to run up the street and a young policeman stopped me. I told him who I was, and he said, "You can't go up there." And I said, "Why not? It's my house, and isn't it?" And he said, "Yes. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hancock."